Hello, and welcome to the Chiefs After the Axis Navies comment response. And the whole way through, I'm going to have the slides basically going through beside me, but they may or may not have any relation to what I'm discussing on the screen, because this is like all the comment response videos, especially ones to lots of videos which are on the same topic. It's probably going to be fairly long, and this is why it's also a long patrol, because it did need to be dealt with as one. And I'm starting off with the questions from Karl Dönitz on his birthday. How capable an admiral was he, i.e. the live on the subject. And the reason I'm starting off with that one is it's the one out of order. In terms of everyone else is nicely in order, but that one, if I slotted it in, would have looked weird, because I'd have been doing Karl Dönitz twice. So I'm doing it in the beginning, because I had to do it at the beginning or the end. Chose to do it at the beginning. So, starting off with the comments in order of how they were actually put up there. We have, from Jessica Liu, regarding Canaris. He had some really mind-blowing schemes in my country. Candace Manowska, Polish, allegedly close friend of Winston Churchill, is just one of the examples. Yes, he did. Canaris, the chief of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence, was a very interesting gentleman, and had lots and lots of plans. We'll get more to him when we get to the questions about him. So, then we start off with Dean Wong. If Australia gets SSNs, then doesn't that set a precedence for Ian veto holders to get nuke boats? Wouldn't that trigger a mass arms race in the Pacific? Now, I'm only getting into this because Tian was labelling under an honest mistake. I then pointed out that Brazil is going down that route and SSN getting SSNs, etc., and that India already has those. Tian Wong then responded that he had no idea why India wants nuke boats. The Indian Ocean is a pretty big place, but also there's the fact that India perceives itself this as a status symbol, and as I pointed out again, they have issues in terms of they might wish to move into the South China Sea if they need to feel they have to counterbalance some of the issues they have with China to their north. And the point he makes, and Don himself makes, is that we aren't privy to their plans. Although Hashem then says they're the ones that chose to make themselves a potential enemy. I'm sorry, Tian Wong. Don't take this as gospel, because I do not consider myself the 100% most well-read when it comes to the issues going on in the high mountains between China and India, but I'm fairly certain that China has pushed forward a significant amount. And I don't think they've really chosen to make themselves an enemy. They just didn't really understand that things were going from a rather sternly wounded discussion, occasionally hitting each other with sticks, to actual pushing forward. And then China is a major power, India is a wannabe major power. That's the big difference. Again, do we have to all be major powers before we're allowed certain weapon systems? Because I'm afraid that's going to cause a lot of issue to start policing. Major powers, those people who call themselves major powers, are going to have to start blowing up a lot of people because they have individual weapon systems which they shouldn't have if they're not major powers. And I'm not being facetious, I'm just saying that's just not an argument about weapon systems. And as Susan points out, China had nuclear subs since the 1980s when they weren't a major power yet. China was interesting in the 1980s. I don't think they were exactly a minor power in the 1980s. And then there's a whole long discussion going on about India versus China. Tian, again, in the nicest way, when you start off with a sentence of, don't get me wrong, I'm not racist against India, However, India is trying to be something they are not, and it's both cringy and it's hurting them. Doesn't really help you. Saying you're not racist against India and then calling what they're doing cringy. You could probably make a case for hurting them because they could be spending the money on other things. But also, that's their strategic defense priorities. They decided they need it. That's it. That's the thing. And they've re-elected multiple governments which have signed up to this. So obviously, that's something the Indian governments and Indian political class and Indian people themselves are fairly settled with. Again, you also returned quite a lot to the China is a major power, India is not. Uh, India's not exactly a small nation or a small power. And nuclear SSNs, I don't take this the wrong way, are not just border status symbols. They're quite useful bits of technology. That's why France, Britain has them. You can argue about their status as major powers. If that's the trouble. If you're starting off with only superpowers should have them, then you're sort of limiting yourself to America at the moment, because as much as China would like that status, they aren't quite there yet, because they have the nuclear weapons and definitely the nuclear arsenal, but they don't really yet have the global projection of conventional force that goes with superpower status. So they are definitely a potential. They are a nuclear power and a major power, but possibly not superpower. But India, I see on the same level as Britain and France, and has interests which depend on a global trade and global movements. And so, yeah, I can understand India having nuclear weapons. They've been handling nuclear boat submarines for a while. They've had them on loan from the Russians. And again, you could point to issues when China didn't have the systems and let's say all the things that they should that you would expect them to perhaps have had for their wealth, but they were investing in nuclear power. Nations do it. And then I have Hashem. Quote from comment from you. Thanks for the program. And to put my honor, please discuss about whether the subject is, discuss less about whether the subject is nice or not nice. Takes a lot of time from ships and naval battles and plan strategy, and adds a little on notice subject. I've entered with much respect for your naval knowledge and communication skills. Thank you very much, Hashem. As I said, and then I respond to that. To be honest, I'd have to add in that just in case add that in just in case someone complains I'm promoting the Nazi Party to my university. This is honestly one of the reasons why I do. When discussing with people, go they're not nice. And again, I will just say that for this one. They're not nice. I am not in any way in this video glorifying or promoting Nazis. In fact, most of the time, I am probably going to be taking the PISS to keep this PG-13 out of them because honestly, Raeder, Dönitz, I'm not the best guy and the best in terms of admirals or strategic thinking. Canaris is pretty good on strategic thinking, but he does sign up to the Nazi Party and then he manages to get killed at the end when he's got his best chance of actually getting rid of them. So, it's fun. Anyway, going from Tien Wong then responds to this one, and this is why I've actually gone into this comment with just a thought: why can't Australia take on retired Los Angeles class nuke boats? They might end up doing so. We don't know. We're talking. I don't think they will take on too many. I think that if they do, they would take on a couple as interim vessels. We've been discussing this in bilge pumps, and my instinct is that Australia could well hire a couple of boats, or at least a couple of boats from America, build a couple of boats on an existing construction line, i.e., probably actually interesting enough, hard two from America because they can do that, and then build two in Britain because of the strain the Americans have on the Virginia line. The Americans have systems, that's fine, but they can produce the systems. and the systems can be fitted in into a modified astute hull. But the astute where the Virginia line, the actual production company slips for boats would need to be expanded, which would take time and at cost for America to produce more Virginia boats than they are, because they're currently going full speed ahead with the Virginias they're building, and with the Columbia class SSBNs. So their lines are kind of overloaded. Britain has 2 slots, broadly speaking, at the 2 slots, broadly speaking, so in its production lines. Again, not a great deal of space, but they do have 2 slots. So you could have a scenario where they lease a couple of LAs, they buy a couple of astutes, and then they by the time they've got those in service and those available, they've then got the production line set up in Australia where they can build their own. And that would seem sensible to me. That would seem a very sensible way to get into the nuclear submarine business, which is also a model of how India's really done it, in that they've built some, what they've done is they've leased some from the Russians, they've got the French building some with them. It makes sense. And yes, they've gone to the French, but they're providing, like the Brazilians, their own nuclear reactors, their own nuclear power. French nuclear reactors don't seem popular for people. A, the French don't seem to be selling them, and B, people don't seem to want to buy them. Might be because they have to be refueled more often. The British and American ones are both on 30-year refuelings. If you buy French, it probably has to go back to France to be refueled after 10 years. Whereas if you built your own domestic one, even if it has to be refueled every 10 years, it comes back to you. It's a case of keeping the money in your own country. Right. Stephen Lane, who in the class would have been a card-carrying Nazi in 1930s Germany? No hands up. Next question. Who has shown their Vax pass to get into a pub, gig, or to travel? I can understand where you're going, but I don't really put the two as the same thing. But because I would say the Vax pass is closer to having a passport, because I've had to use my vaccination pass to get into Jersey and various other places I've gone in the last, or since I've been vaccinated, because I've had to move around for various filming and those things. So I have used that, but I treat it more as it's more like my driving license, passport, those sort of things. It's something I have. Joining a Nazi party is something it's not a card you have on you. It's not something you have just to flash and go, yeah, I've done that thing. I've got my driving license. I'm allowed to drive a car, or I've had my vaccinations. I'm fine. You can let me in. It's a whole thing which you end up being snared into. But the thing is, that's how the Nazi party worked. They had after-school activities clubs, all sorts of different things to just ensnare people into them. So they did that a lot. I'm definitely don't agree with your comment about anyone who learns about Canaris can learn one lesson that applies to intelligence agencies' first loyalty is to each other. No, their first loyalty is to the nation. It always is. I've met many fine intelligence personnel in my life, all of whom uniformly to a person claimed they weren't, all of whom I am 100% sure, because of their various roles of what they went and doing, were. Including one who I'm very certain of, because later on I saw them on, a few years later I saw them on television as being part of that world, and I went, I was right. Anyway, leaving that to one side, they are, in my experience, universally incredibly loyal to their countries. The thing is, with Canaris, is he decides, as when he thinks the Nazis are good for the country, he's loyal to them. When he thinks they're not, he's loyal to his country comes first. John Evans, then. By what measure is the Ibuki a battlecruiser? And I have answered this in various videos on the Japanese cruisers, because, as I said there, it requires more than words. It required pictures. So, getting on to Chief of Staff of Axis Navies Video 1 and Long Patrol 1 of 14, Erich Raeder. Starting off with John South. Historically interesting, but one of the officers Erich Raeder purged in 1931 for getting engaged to a woman when he had a prior commitment to another woman was a young lieutenant called Reinhard Heinrich. It would be interesting to know what would have happened if Heinrich had stayed in the Navy and never had an opportunity to rise in the SS, as he joined a Nazi party the day after he was kicked out of the Navy and joined the SS 6 weeks later. Honestly, I doubt Heinrich would have done as well in the Navy as he did in the Nazi party. There is a certain level of promotion that happens for people of that ilk in organizations like the Nazi party, and he is not a nice person. And I am saying that because the words I would like to say to describe him are definitely not PG-13. So he is not a nice person is because my cousins watch this, as well as students from the university occasionally, and occasionally fellow lecturers who then make strange phone calls. Good, Nick Dvoran, good video. I agree with things like the general purpose gun, but I can understand the rationale for the Panzerschief. But why build freedom? For Deutschland, it makes some sense as a kind of technological demonstrator, but save the money from Scheer and Spee for the time after the suppression. Maybe build Scheer if you need to save the industry, but then wait, and after you've tested what you can do with the ships and the technology, whatnot, in 1933-35, since you couldn't really foresee that a certain Austrian corporal would rise to power in 1928, and you have tested the ships as a whole, technology is enough to order the next batch of whatever ships you can build. Maybe put some destroyers or torpedo boats in between. I would certainly agree with that. But Street Racer then comes up an interesting point. You need at least 3 to be able to risk sending one out. If you have 2 and you lose one, then you have 0 when the remaining one is getting maintenance, doing training act. Very good point. But honestly, if you're going to start sending them out and they are honestly part of your strategy, you need 4. And therefore building batches of 2 and building a second batch of 2 is sensible. Or at least maybe 5 or 6. That's the other problem with the Panzerschief. There isn't enough of them. It's one of the interesting things is what would have happened if a second Panzerschief had been at the Battle of River Plate? If the Germans had built more of them. And maybe they built them a bit faster and a bit better. Maybe with 8-inch guns rather than the 11-inch. But there again, that does make them actually proper heavy cruisers if you consider the armoured cruiser development. Nick Vaughan, I want them. It is a kind of test bed. I would send them out if I don't have to. I wouldn't send them out if I don't have to. That's why I wrote I would save Scheer and Spey if I could. But maybe I am forced to build Scheer to keep the industry going. After Deutschland, I would get my hypothetical follow-up to the Deutschland in 1933-34. Maybe it be the D-class Panzerschief or the Scharnhorst class or something completely different. I think I could get 3 Scharnhorst or 4 Panzerschief D for my money and probably better ships because the flaws of the equipment would be eliminated with Deutschland. If I got the D-class, I would get 4 29-knot ships with armament similar to Deutschland. And for dual-purpose guns, they would either have 105mm or 127mm guns as secondary. That would have been tested on Deutschland. If I get to build the Scharnhorst, I may gamble and get a 15-inch gun for it. The dual-purpose secondary guns. Street Racer, Nick Vaughan, pretty sure 1 is enough for testing, but what issues do you think they'd resolve by testing them? Just making the bow higher, maybe? This is actually an interesting idea, and actually is something which I would consider looking at in a video in the future. What could have been the other options they could have done with the Deutschland, with the Panzerschief? What the follow-up Panzerschief could have been? I have to do some more research into it. Find out if there's a decent book. How would you power? How much power can you really get out of a late 1920s? Early 30th century diesel plant. It was less than they thought. That's one reason why they reverted back to turbines for the D-class Panzerschief. Is my industry capable of producing 11-inch guns? If Weimar continues, I don't see how you can go higher than that. How good are these guns? How well works my Dow dual-purpose secondary on a full-on warship? Not only on a gunnery training ship. How good is my industry in producing armor plate? How good can my optical industry produce rangefinders? Can they be improved? Later use it to test how to make good radar not disabled by heavy guns. In the meantime, have a shiny ship to impress countries with a smaller navy. Force the French to build a response. That's what Dunkirk was. And yes, things like hull form too. And as I said, the Scheer in my scenario is economic and no military pressure. It's an economic and not a military measure. I think you're onto an interesting idea, Nick the Warden, and I would like to have actually, start working through that a bit. Harry Veal. Hello, Reveal. I don't think I've read a comment from you before. We don't mind that you're running a business as a cover to get around a treaty. That if we are caught breaking might bring both Britain and France down on our heads. We mind the fact you couldn't at least run it away and make money as well. Yep, that sounds like politicians' take on it. True, it caused huge problems for the German Navy, that film company. The fact that it went bankrupt. Seriously, in the golden age of cinema in the 1920s, they managed to make a film company go bankrupt. How? Many of them went bankrupt. That's the obvious solution. Oh, who would have gone into making movies? Oh, good lord. What they should have done is tried to make themselves the German franchise of one of the big American studios, and use that as cover. Then put in money that way. Then it wouldn't have probably gone bust, or not bust as quickly. Hieroglyph. Hello, Hieroglyph. It's not that Raeder was incompetent. He just wasn't a Nazi or a traitor. I was expecting Germany to war, if at all, in the mid or late, preferably late 40s, preferably as part of an anti-USSR alliance. I would broadly speaking agree with that. Raeder is a Nazi to an extent that he needs to be a Nazi for his post. Not a massively committed one. Certainly not like Dönitz. Or Erich. I would say he's foolish in that he trusts Hitler about when the war's going to be. And I'd say that the trouble is he's also responsible for delivering his plans, and he doesn't even deliver on his earlier plans. He has plans in 1929. He doesn't deliver on it. He has plans in 1932. He doesn't deliver on it. He has plans in 1939. Does anyone really think he's going to deliver on them? No, because he writes up plans for what he needs. At no point does he go and look at the industry and go, you know what? We can't actually build that. I'm sorry, chaps. We don't actually have the dry dock, or the slipway, or the cranes, or the armour production plant, or the armaments factory. In fact, we probably need to conquer Czechoslovakia quite quickly to have any chance of producing this, and we actually need the Skoda works to be working at full pelt. So can we please keep the Goring brother out from controlling it? There are lots of various things Raeder needs to do. Doesn't do any of them. Street Racer. The C is pronounced Zorse. I'd go for Jonathan Moller. I'd go further and say Sauce. Zorse. I will try and get better. I am trying to get better. You have to remember that this is going to sound strange, but again, most of my time in the last few years has been teaching history of engineering to engineering students. Believe it or not, I don't have to wander into foreign languages that often now. And as a little background, I know people don't prefer to talk about the history, but sometimes I do need to explain some stuff about me before I'm talking about history. Because of my dyslexia, it was decided by my school when I was 13 that I was bad enough in English that I couldn't do foreign languages. And honestly, I was annoyed about German because I had a lovely German teacher. She was a lovely lady. But I wasn't upset about missing out on French because the French teacher was lovely when I wasn't in a French lesson. When we weren't in French lessons, we got along quite well. The moment we were in French lessons, he changed. Juicy Fusion. The poor logistics of too many calibers seems endemic to German military thinking at that point. Optimum engineering choices regardless of our criteria, just like the Tiger tank? Pretty much. Kingsrow. Definitely looking forward to the less talked about chief of staff of all the navies that don't normally get talked about. I hope I made you happy on that one. Tracy Locker. It's an interesting aspect for sure. Thanks for covering it. Thank you. Mac Lemons, I have an old photograph that has the Raeder guy in it. Ooh. Scipio Africanus, but he was a less doctrinaire Nazi. How would you rate Raeder as a political admiral? Raeder thought he was a political admiral, but not a political admiral. He wasn't a political admiral. He thought he could change Hitler to being CMAC Lodi. He thought he could, change him to being a pro-naval person, and yeah. Then Michael Lowry, the dates of the dates of Raeder you don't know that you and Wikipedia and the book I was looking at for it don't have. Frigate Captain, April the 26th, 1917. Captain Lieutenant, March 21st, 1905. Ober Lieutenant Saucy, April 9th, 1900. The Royal Navy during World War I gave rank equivalencies for lower-ranking German vessels one rank higher than indicated. For example, the RN considered a captain lieutenant to be equivalent of a lieutenant commander. That is true. However, so my answer to that was, of course, partially explaining about the book, but thank you, not just me and Wikipedia didn't have, the books I had actually disagreed on it. So I just went, leave that. The RN had fun issues with German ranks in that you're quite correct in World War One. By World War II, it was more murky, and as this video is primarily around World War II, I thought for simplicity's sake, but someday I do have to do a whole series of ranks, and that is something. If you comment below, if you'd like to see a whole series about ranks, I'm very happy to do a whole series of ranks, but it's going to be a fun one. And now it's on to part 2 of 14, Prince. Now, here's the thing. One thing. Fushimi Hiroyasu. Hiroyasu. Fushimi Hiroyasu. Hiroyasu. I think. Possibly Juicy Fusion. Juicy Fusion is thank you very much for trying to correct my pronunciation. It's very kind of you. And I am trying my best. I will hopefully get better in time. If I don't, just keep correcting me, and eventually I will learn, hopefully. Dan Freeman, what was the issue that the IJN and IJA viewed each other as existential threats to Japan as much as they viewed the USA as one? Honestly, there are so many different things which go back about the IJN and IJA. There are competing samurai clans, competing this, competing that. Honestly, the more and more I read about Japan, the more and more it reminds me of academia, which might be wrong. It might be that my own life in academia is reflecting it. I don't know. It might be the fact that at the moment I am seeing more and more issues in academia, but we'll leave that to one side. Basically, the point is that a long time ago, I asked a question of a professor who is someone very learned who I have respected for many years, and asked him why do the fights in academia go on for so long? And his response was, because the prizes are so small, there's no value in coming second. And that's the trouble in Japan. There is a lot of obsession with building up the frontline things, the heavy equipment. There is not enough in building up the infrastructure in the industry. They want the trappings, and they're keen to get them, but they don't build up the infrastructure in the industry, which means there is nothing really to fight. There is not that much to win. And conversely, which is why it makes so much vicious fights between the IJN and IJA, because the prize is so small. There is no prize for coming second. But conversely, this also affects, as I've said in other videos, their thinking when it comes to World War II. Because for them, the prize is so big, the port of the world are not. Surely America and Britain would be happy with just having a third of the world each, and Japan getting the remaining third. Surely. That's just equitable. To be honest, Britain will probably complain that under that idea it was getting Europe and Africa. And one was quite a nice place with lots of lovely civilized people that it had to deal with, that it could deal with and could help. And, well, when I say help, I mean find a way to financially exploit while looking good. This is the Age of Empires at the end of it. Please, let's be honest. But there was when these things, assisting things, would help us with that. We were fully keen on them, railways, etc. We could have built a few more. That would have probably been more helpful the case of saying beneficent empire, but we'll leave that to one side. What the thing is, though, then there's Europe, which is full of fascist dictatorships, communist dictatorships, the French. Turkey and Greece, who keep warning the French. You know, there are lots of other things. That's not really fair. You know, in the nicest way, at that point, I think if Britain would be petitioning to swap places with Japan, you want a third of the world have it. And also, it doesn't really work. Because Britain and America want the whole world. Yeah. Take this wrong way. Empires empires are a legacy of a mercantilist worldview. Okay, that's where you basically believe that it's control of resources which give you wealth. So mercantilism, and that's very very simplistic. Okay, but I'm a historian, not an economist, and I'm not doing a whole video about mercantilism. You have to physically control something. But after World War II, you move to a sort of capitalist world order. I know the Soviet Union doesn't like that, but they managed to vote themselves out of it. Where what matters is control of capital, the money which is invested in things, and the returns from that investment. And in this sort of informal world empire, rich people become your super weapons. That's going to shock people. But they do, because those are the people who are investing capital. So you want as many rich Americans and as many rich British people and as many rich people on your side as possible, because they're the ones who control the capital, because they're investing their own capital. Which is why, realistically, when you start, and this is not one of the things which enters into discourse a lot, one of the reasons why governments often make very, very showy attempts of going after taxing the 1%, the really highest of high earners, the wealthiest of the wealthy. But it's a show more than a reality. There's always some various things written in there. Usually, if they invest in certain things and put their capital in certain places in certain ways, which strengthens the government in some way or strengthens their foreign policy in a way, there's a loophole. But that's a historian's approach. I'm sure there are economists who'd be sitting there going, no, that's not how it works. But it just, if I'm looking at it, that's where I sort of see it. And that's really trouble, because Britain and America were going through that transition in the 1920s. You can honestly look at what Britain is trying to do in the 1920s and 1930s, because we always talk about America coming in after World War II, demanding Britain relieve its empire and all those things and sort of decolonize as quickly as possible. The thing is, they're demanding Britain do something Britain was already doing. It just wasn't doing it as quickly as the Americans wanted to, because Britain didn't think. Britain, for some reason, had this idea, which is actually quite a nice idea in one way. It's that, okay, byproduct of empire. We have spent the last 100 or so years running this country pretty much by force. So the things which are really well trained and and strengthened up are the army and the police, not the democratic systems that tend to keep those in check. That is our fault. Rapidly Decolonizing will create a power vacuum, which could lead to perceptions of socialists or communist uprisings, which could then lead to overcompensations by these groups, which could then lead to civil wars. This is something which, to an extent, British academia and various other parts of Britain were actually talking about. But America's view was you decolonize rapidly and that stops the socialist takeover. What actually ends up happening is a race between America and the Soviet Union to prop up strongmen who would often coming from those very same groups which the British and French have been using to control their areas and are training up as armies. I'm not saying anyone actually knew what was coming, they all hoped it wouldn't, but there were a few people who were sort of putting two and two together and going, this is going to make it fall. Okay. And so this is the trouble for Japan. They're still stuck in the mercantilist empire world, and Britain and America have moved forward. Dan Vureman, would his views have been shaped by his training in Germany, setting his frames of reference of operations and considerations for naval logistics, i.e. not very good from a naval point of view, even though he had later been to Britain for further training, albeit Britain's industrial might at the time, would be pretty daunting to consider trying to match, and pre-World War Britain did not have so much of an RFA type setup due to having coaling bases all over the empire, or also was not thinking about campaign fighting in the vast insular Pacific. Apologies for the long, rather nuanced question, but I want to know how shared presumptions I was making for the context of the question. To an extent, yes. Yes. Prince Fushimi Hiroyasu. Thank you, Tsushima. Would certainly have been thinking that, but also there's a lesson of what he can build. Here is the thing. If you're making the case and you have to get the army support for something, the Japanese army is also not famous for logistics. And both services in World War II suddenly find themselves scrabbling for amphibious ships and all sorts of things because they haven't built up the logistics train they need. You can far more easily sell a big, shiny, sharp thing than you can a truck. That's it. And that makes a lot of issues for it. And that sets up lots of problems. But also, I think you also undersell the level of the Japanese should have been paying attention to the fact of themselves fighting in their own area. They pick when to start the war. You can say they're forced by circumstances if you want to make that case, but they pick when to start the war. They pick the date. They pick the time. So they could have done things better. Maybe not ordered all ships out of American ports or something like that, because that would tip off the Americans, but they could have, I don't know, built a few more tankers. Maybe set up and this is always tempting to me if I was Japan, set up a nationally owned freight company. Or like Britain did with Cunard and White Star Lines and all sorts of lining of large ship-owning companies had all sorts of deals with them. And this was Britain. And this would produce, in wartime, would provide the Royal Navy with some armed merchant cruisers. It provided them with fast liners for troop transports. It provided all sorts of things. Yeah, there's actual viability of stuff here that they could have gone for, but they didn't. That's a problem. Steve Winch, here's one for you. While on a student's holiday... No, no. I missed out Juicy Student's question, sorry. I think Fushimi and Japanese leadership in general post-Meiji struggled with the feeling that they needed to respond to the superficial aspects of foreign empires, the battleships, rather than the underlying structures that gave them the power, the infrastructure and developed economies. which led to a lot of poor decision-making as they missed the forest for the trees. You can certainly make that strong case. See Winich, hello. Here's one for you. While on the student's holiday, he went down to Munich and bought a painting from an obscure street artist. They shared a meal and meaningful discussion at the outdoor cafe, which changes his life forever. Yes, I know, timing's not even close to matching. Imagine it's Hollywood script or a History Channel doc. Because of this, upon returning home, he changed from the peace party to the war party. Unfortunately, the painting was lost, used as a liner for his birdcage. No. That definitely didn't happen. I think the Doctor is right about the Japanese chief of staff being unknown. I never heard about this one. Andrew Cox. Would 3 Yamatos really have made any difference to the war? Hugh Fisher. Nope. My understanding is that Dr. Clarke is saying it would have been the infrastructure that mattered, not the 3 more Yamatos. If Japan had built the extra shipyards, they would also have had to build up the steam turbine manufacturing, electrical manufacturing, oil supplies, shipyard workforce. 3 more Yamatos get launched and in service in 1941 too, and either get sunk by attack or parked in naval bases somewhere as useless. What really matters is those 3 extra shipyards can now start building 3 Shokaku or Taiyo carriers are able to replace the losses in 1942. Again, they're not going to win the war, but maybe a chance of being able to drag it out long enough for USA to get tired and settle for a negotiated peace. Arguably, this is always sort of an issue, but that's kind of what Vietnam managed to achieve and what Afghanistan sort of managed to achieve. I know they're different contexts, and that thing, but they waited for America to get tired. And I don't think Japan was going to get away with that because they did attack American soil. But that might have been a strategy. Andrew Cox. Yes, but he did specifically mention building more Yamatos as well. I suppose that would be an understandable outcome, as the thinking was still in terms of the big gun battle. But I expect a 3rd Yamato would have sat in port with his sisters until it was too late. To be honest, actually, I did mention the 3rd Yamato because that would have been a reason they would have actually built the infrastructure. But also, it could have been converted to a carrier, kind of like the 3rd Yamato was converted to a carrier. So a 4th Yamato or a 5th Yamato. To an extent, I disagree with Dr. Clarke about the infrastructure. The carriers are nice, but the bigger impact will be a larger pool of experienced pilots. Don't forget, by the end of the war, the Japanese were using carriers as decoys as they didn't have the planes or pilots. With hindsight, and probably some clever foresight, you'd want to expand and revise pilot training in aircraft manufacture, which I addressed in other places. And yes, you would want to, but I addressed it in other videos and just talked about it. But also, if you have more infrastructure in the first place and are building more ships in the first place, you tend to have to develop more. This is the thing. To an extent, the Japanese maritime industry, whilst you cannot describe it as a cottage industry, you can certainly describe it as more cottage than the American or British. It's actually... I have to say, the example I tend to give is the French. When I'm talking to students, I make the point, the Japanese maritime infrastructure is kind of like the French maritime infrastructure. There are pockets of it all around the country. And each pocket is individually quite good. But getting them to work together is a nightmare. Getting them to work in sync is incredibly difficult. And actually, what you need to do is build up each one enough so that you can almost specialize each yard on one type of construction. But because you don't want to do that because of politics, you end up what you have in France. And it's kind of similar in Japan. Andrew Cox. 3 large carriers would also increase the pool of experienced pilots, which would have allowed the Japanese to carry on longer before they ran out. Again, this is what I'm going to... Dan Freeman, more carriers might also lead them to disconnect aircraft units from the carriers and start to have developed more in parallel than mated together. Even if one accepts the premise that the Axis forces, especially during Japan, were geared up for a short, quick war, they don't seem to be prepared for a short, quick war that would probably follow soon after. The Ascend Carrier Force doctrine was similar in seeing carriers as lacking staying power, but still believed on training up replacement or expansion aircrews. Again, this is the thing. If you have more ships, if they built up the infrastructure, as I said, they could have built up the infrastructure in the early 1930s. There are lots of reasons they could give that. And then when they leave the treaty, which leads on them leaving the treaty, they could have then advanced forward. They could have pushed forward. Andrew Cox, would you actually need more carriers though? Ultimately, it was lack of pilot training facilities and building up experienced pilots which failed the Japanese before they ran out of carriers per se. Again, if you have more carriers, you have more pilots. If you have more pilots at the beginning, then you have more time to set up a training process if you haven't already set one up. But you probably also set one up because you've got more transition between the things, the air groups. And especially because you've had to stand up more carriers. Jonathan Muller, a comment of state of preparation of Axis Navy's the outbreak of war. I know this is a bit of a rabbit hole for determining times of conflict in the first half century, but I must remind everyone that Japan had been at war since summer 37, engaged in some hostilities since several years before that. Yes, but in China, not a naval war. And whilst that does distract the army per se, that's not really invading Japan. And they also could build some stuff in Korea if they wanted to. We Brits tend to consider the duration of World War II according to our participation in it. But if you look at the Eastern Asian perspective, which I believe to be relevant in the context of this video, the war started 2 years before Poland was invaded. True, which is why I start the Chiefs of Staff off when I do. So, from an operational perspective, the IJN had no option other than building up and running full pelt by the time our war started. Yes, the second Sino-Japanese War was not a huge strain on the IJN, but it was a war which required their effective participation and readiness to see off third parties, and this was their opportunity for, let's call it, live fire exercises at active targets. True. But World War II didn't start for them in terms of fighting the British and the Americans till 1941, 2 years later than that. So they had a 4-year build-up. And right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this video now because it's already reached 47 minutes. And there's going to be more parts. So expect follow-up videos with more of these parts in. Thank you.